Welcome, everyone. Well, this is Michael Forster from Code Cloud, along with my compatriot Sanjeev. Welcome to a live stream about the AWS Developer Associates. Good day, good afternoon, good evening. We can't wait to explore this certification with you and talk about some goodies that we can offer to everybody. Okay, so we're going to dive into some content. So let's go ahead and open up the presentation. All right, so today we're going to talk about the specifics of the AWS Developer Associates certification course and about the certification itself. And we're going to move on to the next slide, please. We're going to talk about basically what the overview of the current certification landscape is. We're also going to talk about the exam and the exam domains that make up the exam. We're also going to give you a little bit of insight around some test prep and some practice questions, both from myself and from Sanjeev, right? Both certified, right, in the developer exam. So we're going to do a little bit of exam overview, cover some topics, a little bit of prep, and then we do actually have some practice questions, a little challenge for the top 3 winners where you could possibly win a voucher to actually take the AWS developer exam for free. And we have another secret surprise at the end, so stay with us. We will be doing Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, post them in the chat and we'll answer them kind of as we see them. But we're going to save a lot of major questions till the very end of this presentation. All right. So let's talk about the AWS certification roadmap. So as you know, I used to work for AWS before I came to Code Cloud. And so what's interesting about this is that the certification landscape has changed a lot, actually, in the last 6 months. So what we're seeing is that right now, it used to just be cloud practitioner in the foundational exams, and they've recently added an AI practitioner exam, which is still kind of in beta. It's about to go live, and it's basically a certified AI practitioner foundational exam for those who want to get that basic experience and certification about how AI works on AWS. And the next section is, this is where the AWS Developer Associates live, is that we have our traditional 3. We have solutions architecture, we've got developer, we've got sysops administration, but we also added data engineering in April, and then the machine learning engineer associates is actually coming out. I believe it goes live in just like a week or 2, but basically you're going to have a machine learning associates exam that's basically going to be part of the repertoire. Next, we have the staples, which is the DevOps Engineer Pro and the Solutions Architect Pro. Both tough exams from my own personal experience, but totally, absolutely worth it. Very broad in what they cover. And then the specialty section is really the one that has changed the most. Database used to be here. Data analytics used to be here. SAP on AWS, which was always an interesting choice. That all used to be here, but now we just have networking, machine learning, and security. And so I can tell you from taking all of these exams that the specialty exams are remarkably deep, remarkably difficult compared to the previous set of exams. But that's not what we're here for today. We're actually here to talk about the AWS Developer Associates exam, but we just want you to know how this fits into the landscape, is that this is an associates level exam. All right, I'm going to pass it on to Sanjeev.
All right, so let's go over some of the details about the Developer Associate exam. The exam has 65 total questions, of which 50 are graded and count towards your score. 15 won't impact your score. That's just more for internal use by AWS. But you won't know which questions are scored and which ones aren't. So you're going to have to try on all 65 questions. You get 130 minutes to take the exam. And the passing score is 720 out of 1,000. And the exam is comprised of 4 different domains. Keep in mind, you're not punished for, guessing wrong. So if you don't know an answer to a question, just guess and, you might get it right. So let's go over the 4 different domains that you'll be tested on in the exam. The first domain is development with AWS services. This is going to make up 32% of the exam. You then have security, which is 26%, deployment, which is 24%, and troubleshooting and optimization, which is 18%. And if you guys look at the exam guide, each one of these domains is further divided into subtasks. So there's going to be 3 to 4 subtasks for each one of these domains. And what I'm going to do is, in this presentation, we're going to go over each of those tasks of each domain, and we're going to go over, some of the types of questions that you might see for each one of these tasks so that you guys are better prepared for what you might see on the exam. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start off with the first domain, which is development with AWS services. And the first task is going to be developing code for applications hosted on AWS. And if you take a look at the exam guide, you're going to see something that looks like this. It's going to provide a list of things that you need to have knowledge of, as well as the skills that it expects you to have. So if you take a look at it, you need to have knowledge of different architectural patterns, whether that's event-driven or microservices-based or monolithic-based. So you need to understand the differences between them. What are the pros and cons of each? You need to have an idea of idempotency, how to implement it within your system, and understand the benefits and use cases of it. You need to understand the difference between stateful and stateless concepts, as well as the differences between a tightly coupled and loosely coupled components, and how you would actually go ahead and implement something like loosely coupled components. You also need to understand how to handle errors in your system. So designing fault-tolerant systems, whether that's using dead letter queues or retries with exponential backoff. And you need to understand the difference between synchronous and asynchronous patterns. So if you take a look at the skills, right, you need to be able to create fault-tolerant and resilient applications, regardless of the programming languages. You don't need to have any experience programming. All of the ideas are applicable across all of the different programming languages. It expects you to be able to create, extend, and maintain APIs, especially with something like API Gateway, as well as writing and running unit tests in development environments, writing code to use messaging services, writing code that interacts with AWS services by using APIs and AWS SDKs, as well as handling data streaming by AWS services. Now, as we go through all of these different tasks and the different domains, I don't want to just read through this slide like I just did. Because I know when I was looking at the exam guide, when I was preparing for the exam, I saw this and I didn't really find it too helpful, because I look at this and I'm thinking, well, what exactly am I getting tested on? What kind of questions am I going to see? I know the different services that I'll be tested on, that's on the exam guide, but how in depth do I need to understand them? So that's what I want to explain today. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at one service, and I'm going to kind of give you an understanding of how in-depth you need to understand this service so that you can see the type of questions that you might expect to see on the exam, and you can kind of apply the same logic across all of the other different services. And so for the knowledge of here, you can see that, you need to understand the difference between tightly coupled and loosely coupled components. One of the ways of implementing loosely coupled components is by using a queuing service like SQS. So let's do SQS, or let's take a look at SQS as an example. So how much do we need to know about SQS? Well, I was a little surprised on the exam because it expects you to have a good understanding of the service, what it does, as well as the different configuration options and the different APIs that a developer would use. So when it comes to the configuration options, you're going to need to know things like SQS visibility timeout. What is it? When would you want to tweak it? When would you want to increase it? What happens if it's not high enough? What are the repercussions? You need to understand things like delay queue, as well as the difference between short polling and long polling. So you need to have that level of understanding of the different configuration options and knobs for every service that's listed in the exam domain. On top of that, you'll also need to know the API that you'll use. This is the developer associated exam, so you need to know which APIs your code should actually use. In this case, you need to know things like send message, receive message, things like max number of messages, as well as the receive message wait time seconds. So if you guys aren't familiar with this, that last API, receive message wait time seconds, that's actually how you implement long polling. So you need to know that level of detail when it comes to these services, and this is going to apply across the board for all of the different services listed on the exam guide. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a simple example problem, just to give you an idea as to what you might see on the exam. So this question here, a company is developing a web application that needs to periodically pull items from an Amazon SQS queue and process them. The developer decides to use the AWS SDK for Java to interact with SQS. Which feature of the AWS SDK should the developer use to pull messages from the SQS queue? So we've got A, receive message, B, pull, C, get message, D, fetch messages. And so in this case, the correct answer is going to be receive message. Now, this is a little bit of an easier question, but you might see more in-depth questions about the different APIs that you need to do to accomplish different things. But hopefully that gives you an idea as to the type of questions that you might see. Now let's move on to the next task statement. So the next one is developing code for AWS Lambda. So this is kind of like the previous one, the previous task statement, but it's specific for Lambda. So this is just understanding Lambda, how to configure it. So you need to have knowledge of things like event source mapping for Lambda functions, stateless architecture, how to test your Lambda function, event-driven architecture of Lambda, how to scale up a Lambda function, as well as how to access private resources in VPCs from your Lambda code. And so the skills, it's going to be pretty straightforward, right? You just need to be able to, create Lambda functions, create serverless applications, and you need to understand all of the different configuration options that you have for Lambda. Things like how do you modify memory, concurrency, timeout, things like layers, extensions. So these are all the things that you need to know for this section. So we don't need to really kind of go over all of the bullet points. It's really just understanding Lambda. And as I said, you'll need to understand the different configuration options. So this can be like, how do we implement environment variables for a Lambda function? You need to understand, different timeouts that you have and how to modify them, as well as things like adjusting memory. And you need to understand things like when you adjust the memory and you increase it, you also get more compute power behind it. And you also have to understand how concurrency is implemented with AWS Lambda, know about the details of reserved concurrency versus provisioned concurrency. And you also have to have an idea as to how to optimize your code for Lambda functions. So things like utilizing the execution context, the different storage options that we have available within Lambda, and how we can handle errors. So we'll take a look at a example question that you might see on the exam. So here, a developer is working on a Lambda function that processes large log files stored in an Amazon S3 bucket. Given the large size of these files, the processing time often exceeds the Lambda function timeout limit. To optimize the performance, the developer decides to break down the processing into smaller, manageable chunks, but wants to avoid downloading the same files multiple times. What is the most cost-effective and performance-efficient way to implement this functionality in the Lambda function? Now, I'm not going to read through all of the different answers just because we have limited time. I just wanted to show you guys the type of questions you might see on the exam for this specific task statement. The correct answer in this case happens to be by utilizing the /temp directory of the execution context so that you can basically reuse the same files on the following invocations of the Lambda function. Now, for the last task statement for the first domain, this is going to be using data stores in application development. So this is all about databases and storage within AWS. And so we need to have a good understanding of what is the difference between the different types of databases. So what's the difference between relational, non-relational? What's the difference between, like a SQL versus NoSQL database? You also need to be able to perform the various CRUD operations on the different databases. So if you're working with DynamoDB, how do you insert something into it? How do you read data? How do you update data? How do you delete data? You also need to understand how to design efficient partition keys depending on how your data is utilized. And you also need to have a good understanding of the different storage options. So when would you use, block storage versus file storage versus object storage? So you need to understand EBS, EFS, and S3. We also have the different database consistency models. So things like strongly consistent versus eventually consistent. You need to understand the differences between query and scan, when you would want to use one over the other. Why is a scan considered inefficient versus a query in DynamoDB? And in this case, it's recommending that you understand keys and indexing for DynamoDB, and it will go into those specific details of designing a table for DynamoDB and configuring the different indexing to make it efficient. You also need to understand caching strategies, depending on what type of database you're using. Understand the different S3 tiers and lifecycle management, as well as differences between ephemeral and persistent data storage patterns. All right, and so what does that exactly mean? Well, once again, understand the different databases that we have available in AWS and understand when you would want to use one over the other. And I do want to highlight, just because DynamoDB is Amazon's flagship NoSQL database, expect there to be a lot of questions about DynamoDB, more for that database than all the other databases. And really make sure you understand all of the different features and how to configure it and optimize it. So let's take a look at an example question. A developer is creating a DynamoDB table for storing user profiles. Each user profile includes a unique user ID, name, email, and creation date. The developer needs to query the table by email and by the date the user profile was created. The primary key for the table is the user ID. So how should the developer configure the DynamoDB table to support these query requirements? So this is all about optimizing the table, setting up the indexing so that we can now query on something that's not the primary key. And so we need to be able to query based off the email and the date. And so the correct answer in this case is we would define two global secondary indexes, one for the email and one for the creation date, so that we can perform an efficient query on them instead of just doing a scan operation. Okay, so now let's move on to the next domain, which is security. Now for the first task, this is all about implementing authentication and or authorization for applications. And you're going to see a bunch of things that it expects you to know. That's going to include things like identity federation, so understanding OIDC. You will need to know things like Amazon Cognito, how bearer token, JSON tokens work, understanding AWS's token service as well. And so really this is just how do we implement authentication and authorization, not just for our AWS account, but also for our applications that are running on AWS. So let's see all the things that we need to know. So you need to know IAM. So you need to understand the different users, groups, roles, permissions. You also need to know Amazon Cognito and AWS STS. I'm not really sure why we put that within Cognito. It doesn't really have anything to do with Cognito in that case. And so the types of things that you might see, or the types of questions are going to be things like, how do you enable authentication on an API gateway? Or how do we provide S3 access to an EC2 instance? And so some of the questions that you might see are something like this. You're developing a web application that uses Amazon API gateway to expose REST endpoints backed by an AWS Lambda function. Users are authenticated via a social identity provider like Google or Facebook. How can you securely authorize requests to the API gateway endpoint? So it's just all about implementing authentication and authorization for various services and your application as well. And so in this case, we could implement a Lambda authorizer for our gateway so that it can validate the tokens provided by Google or Facebook. Another example is you have a microservices application deployed on Amazon ECS. You need to securely enable inter-service communication, and each microservice should authenticate to others and should be allowed to access specific resources in S3 and RDS based on its role. How can you achieve this? And so this is just a matter of assigning a specific IAM role with the necessary permissions for that specific ECS task. All right, now for task statement 2, this is going to be implementing encryption by AWS services. So this is all about understanding encryption. What's the difference between encryption at rest versus in transit, certificate management. So this section or this task is going to focus heavily on KMS and also how to implement encryption for various services. And so, as I said, if you're using S3 as an example, you need to understand the different encryption options. So what's the difference between SSE S3 versus KMS versus C? When would you want to use one over the other? On top of that, it's going to apply the same thing across all of the other services like Secrets Manager, Parameter Store, DynamoDB, RDS. How do we implement encryption for all of these different services? You need to understand the different options that we have for each of these services when it comes to encrypting the data.
Sanjeev, I have a question for you. When
What's up?
you retook the exam recently, did you see any questions about client-side encryption for S3 at all? I'm just curious if one like popped into your head from taking the exam.
I don't remember specifically if there's one on client-side encryption. I know we had some encryption for S3, but I think it was not specifically for client-side.
Okay,
But
just
it
curious.
will expect you to know that, though, I think.
Yeah, well, and they had talked about making sure there were no more questions, and I wasn't sure if that had been removed. If you didn't see
Oh,
it,
okay. All right.
so cool. Thank you.
All right. And so as I mentioned, you do need to know KMS because KMS is important when it comes to encryption and managing your keys. You got to understand the difference between managed keys, AWS managed keys versus customer managed keys. And you need to understand the API that KMS uses. So how do you create a key? That's going to be the create key API. How do I encrypt some data using KMS? You use the encrypt API, the decrypt API for decrypting. And then you need to understand envelope encryption. You will get questions about this. So understand why you need envelope encryption, how it works, and what is the API that you use to actually implement envelope encryption. So in this case, the generate data key is going to give you a data key to perform the encryption and decryption with. All right, so let's move on to the third task statement for security. This is about managing sensitive data in application code. So this is going to be understanding and classifying what is considered sensitive data. things like personal identifiable information, protected health information. You'll need to understand environment variables. What are they? Why do we use them? So that we don't, ultimately they're used so that we don't have to hard code certain sensitive data into our application code, which will then get pushed into GitHub, which multiple people have access to. Then you have to understand how to implement secrets or manage secrets utilizing services like AWS Secrets Manager and AWS Systems Manager Parameter Store. And so let's go ahead and take a look and see. And once again, I just want to highlight, these are the three things you need to know for this section. Understand environment variables, understand Systems Manager Parameter Store, and understand Secrets Manager. And usually when it comes to not storing certain configs or certain information in your application, you can use Systems Manager Parameter Store or Secrets Manager. A good tip for the exam is if it's sensitive data, if it's not just generic configuration options, usually the correct answer is going to be Secrets Manager. AWS wants to kind of push you away from System Manager Parameter Store when it comes to secrets, even though they can handle secrets as well. It's just something to keep in mind for the exam.
Well, and the other thing to mention there also is that anything involving the random rotation of credentials, Parameter Store can't do that. And so it's interesting how they make that distinction a lot to just when they have both answers to make sure that you go after Secrets Manager.
Yep. Yeah, because a lot of times you can do things in multiple services, but understanding those slight nuances is the difference between getting it right or wrong. But let's take a look at an example. In this case, a developer is building an application that processes sensitive customer data and needs to ensure this data is securely managed and stored. The application uses Lambda for processing, S3 for storage, and RDS for relational data storage. To enforce strong security practices, the developer needs to ensure the data is encrypted during transit and at rest. The encryption keys are securely managed using AWS services, and environment variables holding sensitive information within Lambda functions are not exposed in plain text. What steps should the developers take to meet these requirements? Whoops. And the answer in this case would be A. So here we're going to enable encryption at rest for S3, and then as well as for RDS. And then we're going to use AWS customer or KMS managed keys and use the secrets manager to store sensitive environment variables for the Lambda function. All right, so now we'll move on to the third domain, which is deployment. And so for this first task statement, we have prepare application artifacts to be deployed to AWS. So this is kind of before the deployment process, getting your artifact, which could be, a Docker image or, just getting your Lambda function prepared and packaged before it actually gets deployed. And so you need to have knowledge of ways to access application configuration data. So here, we already talked about Parameter Store and Secrets Manager, where you could store data configuration. You also need to learn about app config as well. You'll need to know about Lambda deployment packaging, layers, and configuration options, as well as Git version control tools like code commit, and understand, container images and ECR. All right, so as I mentioned, focus on config, AWS config, parameter store, secrets manager when you would use one over the other, just like we saw in the previous section. And on top of that, learn about the different tools that we have when it comes to packaging Lambda functions, understanding Lambda layers, and also make sure you understand, building Docker images and storing them in a container registry like ECR. So an example question, a company is deploying a serverless application using multiple AWS Lambda functions, which are managed by AWS Code Build and AWS Code Pipeline. Each Lambda function needs to access common libraries that are frequently updated, and the company wants to ensure that these libraries are packaged separately and can be easily shared across multiple Lambda functions without modifying the function code each time the library updates. Which AWS feature should the company use to achieve this? So anytime you have Lambda functions or multiple Lambda functions that utilize the same dependencies, you can use a feature called Lambda layers to store those dependencies so that your Lambda functions can continue to remain small, and all of those dependencies are stored in those Lambda layers that can be shared across all of your Lambda functions.
Yes, Sanjeev, just to ask for a moment, there was a question about, isn't code commit, for example, deprecated, which isn't in your list here per se, but code build and code pipeline is. And to answer that question for everybody is that AWS is going through this kind of purge right now where they're getting rid of a bunch of services that haven't really kind of been profitable for them and that don't have adoption. So things like code commit are actually still in the exam currently. Usually takes them a couple months, like 3 to 6 months to actually take it out of the exam. So if you take the exam in the next 90 days, you will actually see questions about things like app mesh and code commit and all of the other services that they've retired. So just FYI for that. Even though it looks like we're talking about deprecated services, they are actually still in the exam, and those services are actually still available for people for the next year if they've already used them. It's just new customers who don't have access to them. So just want to make sure that's clear from a domain perspective. Thanks.
Okay, so the next task statement is testing applications in development environments. And so here it's going to give you a bunch of things, but what I want to highlight is really this is all about how do we spin up development environments within AWS to test our code. That's what it's actually asking. And so to spin up a test environment so that we can actually test our new application code, it's going to be different depending on the different services or platforms that you're using. So if you're using something like Elastic Beanstalk, how do we spin up a like a dev environment or a test environment? Well, with Beanstalk, we have the concept of environments. So you have a prod environment, which is what your users will be utilizing. And if you want to test new code, you could just spin up another environment, call it dev or whatever you'd like, and then you can test it on there. So it's very easy with something like Beanstalk, but you need to understand the differences between the different compute platforms. Like how do we do this in Beanstalk versus something like API Gateway? With API Gateway, it's a little bit different. With API Gateway, we have this thing called stages. And so we can create different stages for different purposes. So we could have a prod stage, which gets its own URL for what is our production environment. And if we want to test our code, we can create a dev environment. And those can all point to different versions of a Lambda function or different Lambda functions altogether. So understanding how to set up development environments within AWS, and on top of that, how to optimize those environments for development or for testing is things that you'll be questioned on. So to give you an example, we have a question here, which is you're deploying a new version of your application with an updated API gateway configuration. During testing in the development environment, you notice that changes to the API gateway are not visible immediately, causing outdated responses. What is the best approach to ensure your team sees the latest changes without delay? So this is an example of, it's not asking how to create a development environment, it's asking how to optimize your development environment to avoid whatever's causing the stale data. So in this case, because we have a development environment in the API gateway, we can disable the cache because we don't really need caching when we're doing any testing or development. So we can kind of speed up the changes. Now for task 3, this is all about automating deployment testing. So it kind of sounds similar to the previous one, but this is mostly about continuous integration. This is about how to utilize services like code build to test your code, run unit and integration tests, as well as set up the necessary development environments to perform those tests. So this is all about automating the testing process. So you're going to be using things like code build to then deploy services and run tests, regardless of whatever platform or services that you're ultimately using. So an example question in this case is a logistics company is using AWS Code Pipeline to manage a CI/CD workflow for their applications, which include managed instances of an Amazon RDS instance and an ECS cluster. They want to ensure that every code commit is subjected to automated database performance tests to verify query efficiency and response times before the changes are applied to the production database. What is the best way to implement these requirements in AWS Code Pipeline? So in this case, the correct answer is add a stage in your code pipeline that launches a temporary Amazon RDS instance and uses code build to run database performance tests with a tool like HammerDB. Another example is a team is looking to automate the testing of their infrastructure as code templates written in CloudFormation. The end goal is to ensure that these templates are syntactically correct and adhere to the company's compliance standards before deploying resources defined in them. Which AWS service and feature can best accomplish this task within a CI/CD pipeline? So here in this case, we can set up a pipeline, and within code build, we can have the necessary steps to validate the templates, and we can run a command like cfn-lint to actually perform syntax checks and validate whatever other corporate policies that we have for our specific templates. And for the last task statement for the deployment domain, we have deploying code by using AWS CI/CD services. So this is really continuous delivery, right? So the continuous deployment, continuous delivery, that's what you're going to focus on. You're gonna get a lot of questions about code deploy on this section. Is really just about, automating that deploying process, handling, rollbacks in case there's any issues, understanding, and this is really an important part, this section right here, deployment strategies. So you need to really have a good understanding of the different deployment strategies for each of the different platforms. You will get a good number of questions on those. Right. And so let's take a look at, just to quickly cover some of the deployment options that we have, just to highlight how important that is for this section. For EC2, you have certain deployment types that you can utilize. You have things like in-place update, and you have blue-green deployments. And on top of that, you have, for in-place updates, you have deployment. You can deploy it all at once, half at a time, or one at a time. So understanding these different options is very important, and understanding when you would use one over the other is also important as well, and you'll get tested on that. So something like deploying all at once is going to upgrade all of your servers all at once. And that's going to have user impact because you're upgrading them all at the same time. So you wouldn't want to do that in prod. But in a development environment, in a testing environment, I mean, you don't have any end users, you're just testing it. So you might want to do all at once. So it upgrades them a lot quicker so you can actually go to testing as quickly as possible. So understanding when you would use one over the other is important for the exam. And then also understand that, for other services like Lambda or ECS, you have other types of deployment types. So for Lambda, you have, the linear deployment type, which if you have two versions of your code and it's currently using version 1, with linear, 10% every 10 minutes, it's going to move 10% of the traffic to the new version. And then after 10 minutes, it's going to add another 10%. And it's going to keep going and going and going until it gets to 100% for version 2. Versus something like Canary, which is, you have all the traffic going to version 1, and then you'll send some amount of traffic to version 2. And then after 10 minutes, if everything's okay and stable, we'll then shift all the traffic over. So an example question that you could get is, a development team is deploying a new version of their web application hosted on AWS Elastic Beanstalk. It's really important to focus on the platform they're using, which is Beanstalk in this case. To minimize downtime and ensure a smooth upgrade process, the team wants to gradually replace the instances running the old versions with the instances running the new version. They also want to ensure that the application's capacity is maintained throughout the deployment process. And that's an important point in this question. And so it's going to ask, which deployment strategy should the team use to achieve this goal? So we've got blue-green, we've got performing a canary, we've got rolling with additional batch deployments, deploying a new version using all at once, using an in-place configuration update with rolling deployments. Now, the correct answer in this case is C, and that's mainly because it's saying they want to ensure that the application's capacity is maintained. So that's what the additional batch means is we're going to do a rolling update, but we first spin up the new ones before we tear down the old ones. But you can see how those little keywords are important to understand what is the correct answer and what is the type of deployment that you want. So you have to make sure you read those questions carefully. All right, so moving on to the final domain, we have task statement 1. And so you'll see a lot of the task statements are kind of similar for this specific domain. Assist in root cause analysis. So this, you need to have a good understanding of logging and monitoring systems. You need to understand how to perform log queries in things like CloudWatch. You have to understand the different exceptions and errors that get thrown within your code, as well as HTTP error codes. And you'll need to be able to identify defects and performance issues within your code, utilizing common observability tools and concepts like logs, metrics, and traces. So this section, right, it's all about identifying source of bugs and performance issues by utilizing logs, metrics, and traces. And you need to understand those three in depth and understand what kind of information each one of those gives you. Understand, what do you get from logs versus something like metrics versus something like traces. And the two services that you'll get questioned on heavily in this section, in this domain, is going to be CloudWatch and X-Ray, and how they kind of translate to logs, metrics, and traces is pretty important. So let's take a look at a question. In this case, we have an application uses RDS for MySQL for database operations. Recently, users have reported intermittent slow responses when accessing the API. After preliminary checks, the developers observed spikes in CPU and memory utilization in the ECS tasks without any identifiable pattern in traffic. Which combination of AWS services and tools can the developers use to effectively diagnose the root cause of the performance issues? And so here we have to select two options. And so in this case, we can utilize X-Ray to trace API requests and identify performance bottlenecks. and we can create a RDS performance insight dashboard to monitor database load and query performance. The next task statement is instrument code for observability. This isn't too different than the previous task, but this is more about setting up your code to actually implement some sort of observability. So how do we actually implement logging? How do we implement metrics? How do we configure custom metrics, not just in our code, but how do we also set it up within CloudWatch? And how do we utilize tracing within our code so that we can actually see those traces within X-Ray? And so you need to be able to implement effective logging strategies. You need to be able to create your own custom metrics in CloudWatch. You need to understand, things like annotations for tracing services, implement notification alerts for specific events or actions, and implement tracing by using AWS services and tools. And so a example question in this case was a developer is responsible for monitoring several microservices-based applications hosted on AWS. Each application consists of multiple AWS Lambda functions and API gateway endpoints. The developer wants to create custom metrics to help understand the performance and operational health of each individual application. The default CloudWatch namespace and metrics do not provide granularity needed for comprehensive monitoring. What is the best approach for the developer to achieve this granularity? So we could set up a custom CloudWatch namespace with a unique metric name for each application in this case. And then finally, we have optimizing applications by utilizing AWS services and features. And so this is really just understanding, things like caching. How can you improve the performance of your application through caching, concurrency, or utilizing messaging services like SQS and SNS? And so in this case, you'll get a lot of questions about caching, and you need to understand the different tools that we can use for caching. What's the difference between, Elastic Cache versus DAX, and understand how we can utilize things like SQS and SNS to improve performance in our application. And so a example question, a company's web application is hosted on a fleet of EC2 instances behind an application load balancer. The application stores frequently accessed session data in a Amazon RDS MySQL database. Recently, users have reported increased latency and slower response times during peak usage hours. The engineering team needs to optimize the performance of the application without significantly increasing the cost. Which approach should the team take to achieve this goal? And in this case, we can implement caching using Elastic Cache to cache frequently accessed session data. And we can also implement auto scaling to dynamically adjust the number of EC2 instances based on the demand. All right. And so those are all of the domains. Those are all the tasks. So hopefully with these questions, you guys have a good understanding of the type of questions you might see. I know somebody asked, how often do you see the multiple or the multi-select questions? You do get a good number of them. So it's not going to be like a couple. You'll see a good number of them. I don't know if it's half, maybe not half, but be prepared to have to select 2-3 options within the developer associate exam. Some tips on preparing and passing the exam. Definitely review the exam guide and take a look at all of the different services and make sure that any service listed on the exam guide, and focus on some of the things that you don't know. So if there's any services or any concepts you don't understand listed on the exam guide, make sure you understand that, because anything listed on the exam guide is fair game on the exam. I definitely recommend taking a course. So courses are nice just because it's a one-stop shop for preparing for the exam. It's going to contain all of the lecture, all of the content material that you'll need to prepare for the exam. It's going to contain, homework assignments, labs so that you can actually practice, as well as mock exams. Those really help get you up and running as quickly as possible so that you don't have to spend time looking in, multiple different resources to kind of piece together all of the information. And as a heads up, we do have a Code Cloud course for the Developer Associate exam that we released, I think maybe not just 2 months ago. So if you guys are interested in getting a course for the certification, definitely recommend taking a look at that. You'll also want to make sure you get hands-on experience. You can read as much as you want about different services, but you don't truly understand it until you actually get your hands dirty and start configuring things, breaking things, and seeing, anytime you tweak knobs and little configuration options, how does it actually impact the behavior? You just get a much deeper understanding of how everything fits together when you actually get hands-on experience. And make sure you take some practice exams. I think mock exams are very important just because you can understand the technology, the services, all of the different concepts really well. But sometimes if you take a certification exam or any type of exam, they ask specific types of questions. And if you're not used to certain types of questions, even though you know the material, you'll find that you'll still struggle to answer them. So taking a practice exam will help you get familiarized with the type of questions that they'll ask so that you don't get thrown off on the day of the exam. And then finally, once you're ready, go ahead and schedule the exam. And hopefully, when you guys take it, you guys can pass. And as I mentioned, we have a certified developer associate course within Code Cloud, which I definitely recommend you guys check out. It's got pretty recent. We just released it just 2 months ago, so it's pretty recent, pretty new. And just to go and highlight some of the different things about this course, we have 32 hours of content. We have 30 hands-on labs and 2 mock exams. And our hands-on labs are really nice just because I know a lot of you guys get worried about creating an AWS account just because you have to put your credit card information in. And if you actually misconfigure something or you leave some servers running, you could end up with a massive bill. And a lot of you guys are worried about that. And so with our hands-on labs, you don't have to worry about that. We manage that. All of the labs are built into your browser. You just click a button and it spins up. It gives you access to an AWS console, your own AWS account, and you don't ever have to put in your credit card information or worry about any unnecessary bills that you could be surprised with. And so just to give you guys a little peek as to how our hands-on labs work, Michael is going to give you a quick demo on our hands-on labs just to show you guys like what you guys get access to within the Code Cloud platform.
Hi, everyone. So let's see. One, just want to make sure you know that we're about to post a link into the kind of challenge that we're about to do with a little bit of practice questions. So just to give you a heads up, right? So you're going to see a little link here for a second to sign up for our little challenge. But before we get to that, let's talk about what's possible. So one of the things that Sanjeev mentioned is that, you want to build your expertise, right, by going through the course, and then how do you get hands-on? So what you see here is just a little screenshot of our actual kind of landing page for the Developer Associates course. And underneath all this course detail, you'll see that there, is basically a list of all of the domain topics that we actually just went through. So our courses are structured remarkably similar to what's out there in the exam topics. And then inside of this, though, is that you'll see that there's a bunch of labs, right, that we have here where you can get hands-on. This all runs in your browser, so you don't have to worry about costs or incurring costs. And you can, restart them and take them, right, as much as you need to. And then here you'll see me starting actually one of the AWS CLI labs in particular. And again, notice this is all just in the browser. Now, currently I'm in the light theme, and you'll actually see me switch at some point to the dark theme. But I don't want you to sit here and watch the loading page. So we're going to fast forward just a little bit so that we can move things forward just a bit. So this part right here is where the lab has loaded and you're actually seeing the instructions page, but it's full screen, right, for just a minute. Because even though this is a CLI lab, you actually do have access to the console. You actually do have access to the account. So you can get in there, take a look around within the confines of the security parameters that exist. And yes, there are some security boundaries that exist in these accounts. So you can go in and take a look and then run whatever you need to fulfill the instructions. Now, if we fast forward just a little bit further, what you'll see is the screen split into this kind of different setup where you've got the instructions on your left and you've got your terminal on the right. Now, you could be in the console both here or inside of another window. But as you can see here, it's asking me a very specific question about what is the CLI command that you run to show the number of VPCs that are in the particular default region that you're in. And so you can see me running the command, you can see me running help. And this is the kind of thing that happens where you get not only access to the console, but in some cases access to the command line as needed to kind of reinforce these concepts and prepare you for the developer exam. So hopefully that gives you the taste, of the lab experience. Again, all in browser. You can add up multiple tabs on the right-hand side, and you can see it celebrates when you do a win. It loads up the next instructions. And so you get that as part of the course, along with practice exams, mock exams that are inside the course as well. Okay. Now we're going to switch back to the slides. Because now that we've covered, the expertise, the domains, we've talked about the domain topics, we've shown you a little bit of the labs, let's talk about the challenge here at the end, because I know some of you are probably interested in winning maybe one of the exam vouchers to take the exam for free. So if we could switch back to the PowerPoints, please. And so what we're about to do is that we are about to basically move into an application called Conf Hub, and it has a quiz in it. And we're going to show you 10 practice exam questions, and the top 3 winners of this challenge are actually going to walk away with an AWS Developer Associates exam voucher that allows you to take the exam one time totally for free. We also have a secret surprise after this for those who participate. So stay tuned. It's not just about the top 3 winners. It might be another dimension there as well. Next slide, please. So here are a few very quick, loose game rules. Is that number 1, right? You must play to win, right? You got to participate. You got to answer the questions. You got to do your best there, right? Number 2 is that the top 3 winners are going to win the Developer Associates exam voucher, as we talked about. So it's to take the certification exam. Number 3, so you got to sign up using the quiz app. So we posted the link already for the ConfMe app, right? And hopefully some of you are already in, which I actually am going to take a look here in a second just to make sure. And then number 4 is that please note that if you're on a YouTube stream, you're going to hear me kind of go through some setup and some other pieces here in just a second. And part of that is that you're going to be slightly delayed from what's happening in real time, somewhere between 5 and 20 seconds. So when we move into the actual exam, I want you to be placing close attention to that web page that you have that actually has the application on it, because that's going to be the reality you interact with. It won't necessarily be my voice. So watch the screen and you'll see what I'm talking about in just a second. But once you sign into the application, I want you to really focus on that app, because there's going to be about a 5 to 20 second lag between, for those of you who are on YouTube versus who are hearing me in real time. Number 5, was there number 5? Number 5. So we do have a special surprise there. So stick around till the end, because we have another dimension beyond the top 3 winners. So hang out with us and play, and let's see where it goes. Okay? All right, next slide, please. Bear with me one second. All right, so this is the page that has the app running, and that's where we got the link from, and that will take you actually to the Conf app. Next slide, please. And so what's going to happen is that when you click on that link, it's going to pop up and say, hey, we want you to sign in. Why do we want you to sign in? Well, we don't really plan on using your information, except we need to be able to send the vouchers to you. So if you sign in, it will capture your email address, and that will allow us to send the vouchers to you, right? So you got to sign in to play. Next slide, please. Once you sign in, which I highly recommend using a social login like Google, for example, it will change and it'll say, hey, would you like to play the quiz? Go back one slide, please. And what you'll do then is you'll click on the play quiz link, and then that will actually take you to the next slide, which will then allow you to see that, hey, you're now in. We've got you queued up. The first question is going to be coming up soon. Good luck. Now, to prepare you, after we get started, you're going to see a screen that pops up, and it's not going to really have anything on it. It's going to say, hey, you've got 5 seconds to prepare. I really want you to be watching that web page or looking at that app, because my voice might be out of sync of what's going on with that application. So make sure you're watching that, because I want the YouTube people to have a fair experience as well, right? So make sure you're watching that application when we get there. So what's going to happen is that after that 5 seconds passes, and I'm not going to show it to you because it'll give the questions away, you're going to see a question pop up, and you're going to see some answers that you can choose. These questions are actually derived directly, not taken from the exam, but from our mock exams, right? So from our simulations. So these are really good questions. As you know, I used to work for AWS, so I have an idea of how to craft them so that they are pretty close to the exam. And so you're going to see one of 4 answers is going to be the right one, and you're just going to choose it. And just note, the quicker you answer, the better your score. So while I want you to take your time and answer and try to get the correct answer, the quicker you get to the correct answer compared to someone else who gets to the correct answer, the higher your score will be. Okay? All right, here we go. So if you don't mind sharing my screen, please. All right, so you see that we're here. I'm going to go ahead and hit start for the first question. So hopefully people on YouTube are looking at that app, because here we go. We're going to hop in. All right, first question launching in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Here we go. All right, so another holdover. Here we go. Okay, you've got 60 seconds. So we got a developer. They plan to use Beanstalk to deploy a microservice application. The application is going to be implemented in a multi-container Docker environment. How should the developer configure the container definitions, the actual files inside the environment? Here are your 4 answers. Do they use the dockerrun.aws.json file? Do they put them in the EBS extensions folder? Do they use the EBS config command? Or are they going to configure them manually in the ECS console? Timer's counting down. Here we go. All right, 15 seconds left. Remember, this is 1 of 10. Just do your best. And if you don't know the answer, take a guess. Usually your first guess is going to be the right answer. All right. There we are. Good. And the right answer, of course, is to use the dockerrun.aws.json to actually set up that multi-container environment, right? Good. See some people there got the answer. Let's take a look at the leaderboards and see what's happening. So Dinesh Patil is actually, let's see, at the top. We see people with 1 point, so it's good. Remember, we want you to guess at least, right? Take a shot. Do your best. Okay, here we go. Next question. Here we are. 3 seconds. All right, we've got a serverless application. It's got multiple Lambda functions. It's been deployed using the serverless application model, right? The SAM CLI. And so a developer wants to manage the deployments of these functions using code deploy. When there's a new deployment, they want 10% of the incoming traffic should be shifted to the new version, to the new deployment every 10 minutes until all of the traffic is shifted from the old version. So 10 every 10 minutes, right? What should the developer do to properly deploy that function so it satisfies this requirement? So is it canary? Is it linear? Is it immutable? Or is it an all-at-once deployment configuration? What makes sense for 10% every 10 minutes? All right, we got about 15 seconds left. If you're unsure, take your best guess. All right, we're at 5 seconds left. Here we go. All right, deploying the functions using a canary configuration. So actually the right answer is linear, right? So a lot of people answered canary, but linear deployment, right? So it's not 1090, it's 10, 10, 10, 10, 10. Remember, a canary, you just put your toe in the water and then you jump in, right? With the linear, you're just doing a measured, steady move every single time. Okay. All right, got a few that are skipped. Excellent. Okay, we're going to hang out for just a second. I just want to explain one concept before we move forward to question 3, which is that there's usually 4 reasons why you don't get the question right? And I run into this personally, having, have all the certifications, right? Just run into this quite a bit. Is that 1, you don't know the feature set or the answer. Like, you just don't know the answer because you don't know the service. That's one reason, which is why we offer classes and experiment, study the material. But the second reason is that what you know about it could be wrong. So one of the reasons to take these kind of mock exams is to reframe and retrain information that may have been true at one point in time, but now is no longer true. So that's the second reason. The third reason that we usually miss a question is because we didn't read the question. Now, oddly enough, that happens quite a bit where you don't read the question, so you miss some key requirement. And then when you read the answers, you answer for the thing you missed and not the requirement. And the fourth reason we miss the question is because the question's bad. That's typically the top 4 reasons. Although I will say that AWS goes through a pretty rigorous process to make sure the questions are good. So, and I'm not saying the questions are perfect. I've gotten some really squirrely questions on AWS. But Sanjeev pointed out earlier that out of the 65 questions, 15 of them are actually experimental questions that don't count towards your test score. So if you get a really wonky question, don't worry. It's probably one of those experimental questions. Okay, good. So let's see. Pausing for a second. Making sure people can join. All right, we're moving on to the next question. All right, next question's coming in 5 seconds. All right. we've got a Lambda function. It's over 80 megs in size, right? So that exceeds the deployment package limit size for direct uploads when it comes to Lambda. So we want to refactor the function so that we can pull in the additional code and other dependencies from another source, right? And this is going to reduce the size of the deployment. So how can you do that? What feature can you use inside of Lambda in order to basically achieve this requirement? All right, got about 25 seconds left. What do you know about Lambda? Is it environment variables? Is it using an alias? Is it setting up layers? Or is it all about execution context? Which is it? All right, 5 seconds left. Take your best guess. All right, here we go. So looks like a lot of you got that right. Layers is the answer here, right? So we can create layers, right? Basically used to pull in code that we need to kind of reuse and keep it out of the deployment package file, right? Kind of like precede, if you will, the deployment. Excellent. Good. Okay. Next question. Remember, we're at 4 out of 10 here, right? So in this next question, company's got a suite of web applications. They're heavily using RDS in a multi-AZ deployment. They got several read replicas, right? So they want to make sure that all the database credentials, any API keys, and any other secrets are encrypted and they're rotated on a regular basis. So you should also configure the apps to use the latest version of the credentials, right, when connecting to an RDS database. So which of the following is the most appropriate solution to achieve those specific requirements? Meaning we want encrypted secrets and we want rotation of those secrets, and we may be able to have the applications to pull the latest of those secrets when we use them. Okay, so the first one is Secrets Manager, right? The second is we could store the credentials in KMS. And the third is that we could use Systems Manager Parameter Store, particularly the secure string data type, or we could, use the AWS Certificate Manager, right, and store credentials there, the ACM. Good. Sounds like some of you may have picked up earlier when Sanjeev and I were talking. We were talking about that rotation of credentials being one of the key differentiators between, say using Parameter Store versus Secrets Manager, right? So it's good. Excellent. Good job there. Okay. Interesting shift there. All right, on to the next question. Okay, so we're using the API Gateway Lambda Authorizer because we want to securely authenticate the API requests, right, using a web application. So the process should be implemented using a custom authorization scheme, which is basically going to accept header and query string parameters from the API caller. So that's going to shape the nature of the authorization request. So which of the following methods should a developer use with API Gateway and the Lambda Authorizer to properly implement that above requirement? Do we use token-based authorization? We're going to use some kind of cross-account Lambda authorizer specifically? Do we want to use the Amazon Cognito user pool authorizer, right? Or do we want to use some kind of request, parameter-based authorization? So again, we got about 15 seconds left. Take your best guess. Or if you know it, go right to it. All right, 5 seconds left. There we go. All right. So in this case, basically request parameter based authorization is what we want to be using, right? Because it's all being shaped client side based on the nature of the request, right? So hopefully that makes sense. Okay. Excellent. Okay. We get some clear, good winners here following up based on both time and points. We'll move on to the next question. All right. So startups recently launched a new mobile game, getting a lot of new users every day. So the founders plan to add a new feature which will enable this cross-device syncing of the user profile data across all the mobile devices. They're really trying to improve the user experience. So which of the following services would actually achieve that? Now, out of the answers here, right, does Cognito Sync make sense? Is it Cognito user pools? Is it AWS Amplify? Or is it Cognito identity pools? Which of those would be the best answer? Got about 25 seconds left. All right, 5 seconds left. We're almost there. Take your best guess if you're not sure. Excellent. Okay, Cognito Sync. Now, I will say that as of yesterday, even I went to look at Cognito Sync just out of curiosity, and I think it's now redirecting to AppSync, but this is still on the exam, so it's still super relevant, right? But yeah, they're kind of making some movements of services. Good. Okay, next question. All right, we're now at 7 out of 10, so we're almost there. Hang in there, by the way. Even if you feel like, we're not sure that we're quite there, hang in with us. Okay, company has a website hosted on multi-container Docker environments. It's in Beanstalk, and they want to integrate the website with the API gateway. And it's basically just going to simply pass client-submitted method requests to the back end. And so it's important that the client and the back end interact directly with no real intervention from the API gateway, particularly after the API method is set up, except for unsupported characters and stuff like that. So which of the following integration types is the most suitable to meet that specific requirement where it's just allowing the client and the back end to interact directly? Is it AWS? Is it the HTTP function? Is it AWS proxy? Or is it the HTTP proxy? Pardon me, the B and D option, just ignore that one. I can just give you that one. That one's not right. That was an accident on my part. So which of the four? AWS, AWS underscore proxy, HTTP, or HTTP proxy? Good. Okay. Yeah, so in this case, since we want unfettered interactions between the client and the back end, we simply just want a straight up HTTP proxy. And since this is not a service talking on behalf of another service, AWS isn't really in play. It's really just the HTTP proxy that we're using here. Good. Okay, we're down to the last few. Next question is queuing up. Good job for those participating. Keep playing. All right, so we've got a Clickstream app, and it's using Kinesis Data Stream, not the video version, not Firehose, right? It's using Data Stream for real-time processing. So we've got the put record API calls. They're being used by the producer to send data to the stream. However, there are cases where the producer is basically restarted in the process. And so what's happened is that we're getting the same data twice to the Kinesis data stream itself. So this has caused duplication of entries inside the data stream, which is going to obviously affect processing because you're going to get duplicate processing by the consumers. So which of the following should you implement to resolve this issue, right? Excuse me. Do we split the shards of the data stream? Like, do we split them? Do we add more shards? Do we embed a primary key within the record? Or do we merge the shards of the data stream? What's going to be the one that allows you basically to resolve the issue of duplication? Okay, so my bad here, actually, because I think there was a mistake in the processing, is that this should be a primary key within the record, actually. So my bad, I actually must have chosen the wrong answer when I set the quiz up, even though I thought I corrected it. Mea culpa. I'll make sure that we remove this question from the results. But yeah, that's actually the wrong answer. So adding more shards will actually just increase the performance. It won't actually reduce the deduplication. Adding a primary key to the record so that when it gets processed, you have a unique identifier to figure out actually what's going on with the record and whether you've seen it before, right? It's actually embed a primary key. So that's why that's the correct answer. Okay. All right, next question. So a financial company has a cryptocurrency application that's been hosted in Beanstalk for a couple of months. So recently the application performance has been degrading, so we decided to check the CPU memory utilization of the underlying EC2 instances in CloudWatch. Now, you can see that the CPU utilization of the instances is there, but the memory utilization is not there. So what is the most likely cause for the reason that you can't actually see the memory utilization of the EC2 instance? All right, we got about 10 seconds left. So is it that the detailed monitoring is not enabled? Is that we need X-ray for it? Is it that CloudWatch doesn't track memory details, or do we need a X-ray configuration file? Okay, well, by default, CloudWatch doesn't track memory utilization because that requires them to be inside the operating system. By default, AWS can see anything the hypervisor can see, but they actually can't see the actual memory utilization for what was going on inside of the CloudWatch. All right. Final question. So a leading commercial bank has an online banking portal that's hosted in an auto-scaling group of EC2 instances. It's got an ALB in front to distribute the incoming traffic. The application has been instrumented, and the X-ray daemon has actually been installed in all of the instances to allow full debugging and troubleshooting using X-ray. So in this architecture, from which source, like where can X-ray actually fetch the client IP address? This is the last question. So are we going to get it from the X forward host header of the request? Are we going to get it from the X forwarded for header of the request? Are we going to get it from the IP address query parameter of the request if it exists? Or are we just going to look at the IP packet and just get the source IP address? All right, we got about 5 seconds left. What's the best answer for retrieving that client IP address? Good. From the X forwarded for header of the request, that's where we're going to grab it. All right. So we're going to end the quiz. It is going to show a leaderboard, but I want to throw one caveat out there is that we're actually going to download the actual leader spreadsheet, right? And we're going to remove that 7th question just to make sure we've calculated it correctly. But let's try that again. Okay. It was, for some reason, it's not ending the quiz, but what will happen is that when we collate the results, we're going to go through and remove question 7. So we'll make sure that it's fair and remove that just from everybody so it doesn't count against anybody's score. And here's a special surprise. So if we can go back to slides here for a second, that would be great. What's going to happen is that the top 3 answerers, which right now it looks like these folks, and it still could be, but we do actually have to account for that wrong question. So we'll go back and take a look at it, right? But what will happen is that the people who participated, who were the lowest 3 scores, are also going to get a bonus surprise. So the top 3 are going to get AWS vouchers so they can take the exam, and we will send that to you through email directly. But the bottom 3 are going to win 2 months of CoCloud subscription so that you can actually take the AWS Developer Associates certification course. So if you even attempted to answer a question and you got one of the lowest scores out of the entire set of people, you're also going to win a subscription. So look for that in the next 2 or 3 business days. So probably be as late as Monday or Tuesday before you see it. But what's going to happen is that you're going to get a surprise email in your inbox if you were one of the low scorers who was really challenged by this exam, so that we can help you prepare by giving you the course for the next 2 months for free. If you were in the top 3, then you're going to get an email from us that says, hey, congratulations, you won a voucher. Here you go. Okay? So we'll announce those again. Like I said, within the next 2 or 3 business days, you should see it. But we've got a prize for the top 3 who perform the best, and we've got a prize for the bottom 3 who, in a sense, perform the worst, but probably have the most to learn, actually. And that's where we start, is we all start from a place of not knowing. So perfect. Okay. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so here we are. And we have covered the exam topics. We covered the domain. And so I'm now going to pass it back over to Sanjeev to answer any questions. If I see some questions, I'll pick them up and pass them to him. The floor is open for Q&A. Sanjeev was the primary author of the course. He's taken the exam recently. He's a fabulous engineer. He's going to answer your questions about anything around AWS Developer Associates. If you have any general questions about AWS, you can also ask that as well. So we're just going to take a quick look. Let's see. Don't think I saw any questions that we missed, Sanjeev. Just questions about the quiz. Let's see. Someone asked, Sanjeev, Do you think it's easy to start with AWS if you're coming from another cloud provider? Right? That was IHEB.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Most of the concepts are going to be pretty similar or identical across the board, across the different platforms. You GCP or whatever you're coming from, they have their virtual network or whatever. We've got VPCs. It's all the ideas are pretty much the same. You just got to know the subtle nuances and the differences between them, but it's pretty easy to go from one to the other.
Okay. Someone else asked, what is the nature of the practice mock exams that's inside the course itself?
I mean, it's designed to mimic the actual exam as close as possible. So we have the same time frame, same number of questions, same type of questions. So we want to kind of simulate that environment as closely as possible.
Cool. Now, you and I worked together on the AWS Solutions Architect course. Someone asked, how much of an overlap does the developer associates have with the solutions associates? What do you think?
There's a good amount of overlap, right? We cover the basics of most of the services that are also used within the developer associate, except for some of the, like the CI/CD stuff. But for the developer associate, I found that we kind of go a little bit more in depth when it comes to some of the configuration options and some of the APIs that you might use as a developer writing code that interacts with them. So you just kind of have to understand the differences between that. So just make sure you understand the different knobs and the configuration options that are specific to writing your code, because that's what the idea of the exam is. It's for developers in this case, versus solutions architect, where it's kind of designing the system altogether. And you may not need to understand those specific details or those nuances that I've mentioned in the presentation today. But yeah, all the everything you learn in the solutions architect, you need to know that same information for the developer associate too. You need to understand the core services and how they work as well.
Good. Someone else asked, they said they find themselves kind of going back to topics that they've already looked at because it's kind of hard to retain the knowledge. There was to ask, do you have any tips or tricks for how to really get that knowledge to stick in once you've seen it?
Tips, tricks. I mean, first of all, hands-on work is always the best. So if you can play with it instead of just kind of reading or, taking a look at a lecture, when you work with it, you get your hands on it and you work on it as often as possible, especially if you can do it on a daily basis, that's going to reinforce those ideas and make sure that you won't forget. But it's normal to forget. I forget. I even had to brush up on some stuff before this webinar, because even just a month ago, I was working on the course and I already forgot some stuff. So it's normal. If you're not working on something every single day, you're going to forget some things no matter what. So just try to get as much hands-on work as possible.
Forgetting can be a blessing with the sheer amount of information that's being dealt with. Yes. Another question that came in was that, are there only multiple choice questions on the exam?
There's multi-select, where you have more than one option, but those are the only two types of questions that you're going to get.
So multiple choice and multiple select. Okay.
Yeah.
Another question that came in from a LinkedIn user was, I find long questions quite confusing. It sounds like they're maybe difficult to comprehend in terms of just the sheer length.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips for how to approach that?
Yeah, there's a lot of filler words in those questions too. So you're looking for key things, we kind of mentioned some of those things, especially with a question about secrets management. When you see that keyword rotation, and things like that, those are the keywords to look for. It'll give you kind of tips on what the correct answer is. You need to be able to identify what is filler and what is important when it comes to what you need to know for that specific question. So when they say oh, we're building a gaming application, that doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter what type of application. You can ignore that part of the question, focus on the keywords, and it makes the question a lot simpler and a lot smaller.
Here. Couldn't agree more, actually. Someone had a tip. They said, it's a good tip to try and teach someone. Would you say that building a course on Developer Associate has deepened your knowledge of the Developer Associates overall, knowledge base?
Yeah, absolutely. Teaching is the best way of learning too, and reinforcing those ideas. There's a lot of things that I thought I knew, but when I was trying to explain it, I'm like, oh, I don't fully know it. And then I end up diving into the docs and then kind of going down a rabbit hole so that I can make sure I can understand those. So, if you guys want to get a deeper understanding, try to explain it to, I don't know, a sibling or somebody.
That's right. Explain it to your mom.
Try to teach your Labrador, see if he can figure out AWS.
I think I would be shocked at how much they could probably pick that up, honestly.
Right.
I don't see any other questions, actually, and we are a few minutes over from our original intention around the webinar. So I just wanted to say, and thank you for being here. Sanjeev, I want to pass it on to you in case there was anything else you wanted, last tips or tricks you wanted to convey to them before we close out.
No, I think that's about it.
Okay. I saw one last question that was actually pretty important. Do we need to be familiar with coding, or would just the basics work? What does the AWS developer exam really cover?
You don't need to know how to code, but you need to understand like coding concepts of whereas like there's no questions about coding in itself, but it's like handling errors within the different services, and more of coding architecture, system design, and how it incorporates within AWS's ecosystem. So if you don't actually know how to code, that's not a problem actually. It's just more about how do you utilize the services within your applications and how you can kind of incorporate them into your overall system.
Okay.
So don't think you have to go around, practicing your if statements and your for loops. It's not gonna be that important.
It's not going to help. So you basically, what I heard you say is that the exam seems to be a little bit more about how developer would use AWS services.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So actual coding is not that important.
Now, if you've never worked with, if you don't code and you've never built like authentication system, you may not understand, token-based authentication. That could be a foreign concept to you. So it can help if you've worked with these technologies before and you've done coding, but it's not a requirement.
Okay, good. Someone asked about how much time would it be ideal. I'm gonna take this one if it's okay. Is that I would say that it really varies quite a bit based on your background experience and whatnot. I will tell you that the average, between the two of us having passed hundreds, if not thousands, of people into the exams, is that it usually takes about 40 hours of study for you to pass an associate's level exam if you're starting from kind of the prerequisite 1 to 2 years that they recommend, right? If you're a veteran though, and you've been working with AWS and you've been in all around the services, even if you don't know everything, you typically go quicker. But the problem is that the exam study fills in all the gaps. So it is about 40 hours. I'm kind of curious, Sanjeev, how long, because you sat the exam, and between developing the course, how much time would you say a beginner would need to invest? What do you think?
Are we saying that they have the prerequisites and then
1 to 2 years and all the background? Yeah.
I mean, I would say for me, depending on how many hours you can allot per week, I think you could, you do 2 months of studying with a couple hours sprinkled in. I think that would work.
Yeah, I agree. One question that came in was someone was asking, do you need to take solutions architect before you take developer, or does it matter?
No, you don't. There's no prerequisite, but it can help because there's a lot of overlap, but you're not required to.
Yeah, agreed. And just to say this is that, not to minimize it, is that out of the 3 old kind of school associate exams, the solution architecture, the systems operations, and the developer, they've evolved quite a bit. The developer is typically considered kind of one of the smaller kind of information sets, even though it's deep into the API. So you're going to be looking at that more than you are in any other section. So while I wouldn't say it's the easiest of the exams, it does have a slightly more narrow kind of knowledge set that's very focused and very deep. Okay, so just know if you want more of us, you can catch us on the Code Cloud platform. Also know that Sanjeev in particular is all over the YouTube channel. You'll see him out there with videos and whatnot. So am I as well. So, if you'd like to hear more, you can always join us for our next live stream or catch us on YouTube. So hit that like and subscribe out there. We love to know what you want and send us some comments, let us know what you want. Otherwise, we will catch you at the next live stream. Thank you so much for being here, and we will see you at our next event.